Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced more funding for home construction in the border city of Windsor. He says it's part of his strategy to boost the province's economy in the face of U.S. tariffs. According to Ford, those tariffs are starting to bite south of the border.
When you tariff Canadians, you're hurting Americans, and proof is in the pudding now. The auto sector, you heard, is $6.5 billion they've lost. And that's just the beginning. It's just going to continue. And the mayor mentioned it. I've always said you can't unscramble an egg. You got to make the omelet larger. I'm getting a little passionate today about this because that guy drives me crazy down south, I'll tell you, and 41 million other Canadians.
So what more do we know about the effort to get rid of those tariffs? Drew Dilkens is the mayor of Windsor. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mayor Dilkens. You had an announcement related to your city and housing development, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But I'd like to start by asking, you had some time with Ontario Premier Doug Ford. I'm curious, did he give you any new insight into what's going on with Canada-U.S. trade talks?
I know that the Premier said he's meeting with Prime Minister Carney next week in Ottawa, and so that would be a great starting point to continue the conversation. We know things are thorny right now, and we're watching, of course, very acutely what's happening across the river and what President Trump continues to try and do to poke Canada.
How confident are you feeling in this moment about the state of those negotiations?
Well, if anyone comes on your show and says that they're confident in negotiating with Donald Trump and where they're at, I think they probably wouldn't be telling the truth. And so the reality is there is still a lot of uncertainty. But, you know, I think regardless of what political persuasion you tend to bend towards, there is no light of day between anyone in Canada and our Prime Minister. We want to make sure that he succeeds, because if he succeeds, Canada succeeds. And so we want to make sure that we get a comprehensive agreement that resolves the vast majority of outstanding trade disputes that exist between the United States and Canada. And of course, in my neck of the woods, I'm really concerned about auto parts and the men and women who make great cars here down in Windsor.
You mentioned that you are a border city mayor, you're an auto city mayor. I'm curious to see how things are going in terms of the impact that Donald Trump's tariffs have had on your community. We're months into this ongoing trade war. How are things standing right now?
Well, I was pleasantly surprised to see our unemployment rate come down 1%. So we're now 10.2. We're the second highest in Canada. But that doesn't really tell the story, Katie. And you will know, and certainly viewers will know, the excitement that was happening here about 7 or 8 or 10 months ago when we had the biggest EV battery factory being built in Canada. All supply chain was building up around Windsor Airport to help support that operation. And then, of course, when Donald Trump came in, everyone got cold feet and said, let's figure out where this president is going. But despite the uncertainty that Donald Trump has created, just last week, we had a multi-billion-dollar global company announce phase 2 of an auto parts supply project that they're building here in the city of Windsor. It's a $300 million project that is going to employ about 1,100 people in the city of Windsor directly related to auto parts. And again, this is a billion-dollar company with 77 factories around the world. And when I said to them on April the 3rd, when they made the first announcement for phase 1, I said, are you going to continue? Because it was the day after Liberation Day in the United States. And they said, oh, yeah, we don't see a world where this isn't resolved by the time we're ready to open the doors. We don't see that world because it must be resolved.
On that same sort of point, when the counter argument would be in this moment is that Canada's having a difficult time attracting investment because of the uncertainty, because they don't necessarily know the rules of the road, because Donald Trump keeps changing them. Is that not something that is really sort of putting a damper or a cloud over any sort of investment and development in your community?
Well, not entirely. And I think what you need to know is that there are a lot of businesses who are looking at the uncertainty and they're looking at the opportunity that is available to them to actually open an operation in Canada, because they're looking at connections with CETA and the free trade agreement that we have with Europe. And they're looking at what happens long term. And they're taking a more nuanced or sophisticated view of how this ultimate negotiation ends up. And we have said for a long, long time that sort of unwinding the integration of the auto industry and the parts sector would be like unscrambling an egg. And I think that is true. And when you look, even what happened yesterday, Governor Whitmer from the state of Michigan going to the White House. She's a Democrat. Michigan is a swing state, but she goes to the White House and she presses her case with President Trump to say, guess what? If you continue down the path that you're on, you are going to cause widespread devastation to workers in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and some of the U.S. southern states as well. How far do you want to take this? Because it's going to be very difficult for you to achieve the stated goal that you have of repatriating all of those businesses under your current course of action. And we know that the president has sort of two fallacies that he's built his argument on. The first is that there are hundreds of billions of dollars of available capital just waiting to be deployed, close the factories everywhere else, abandon the asset, and build in the United States. That's fallacy number one. That doesn't exist. But fallacy number two, the more important one, is the U.S. has 4.2% unemployment today. They simply don't have the workers to be able to make these businesses successful. And the one thing that I have learned over the past several years of being mayor of this community is that there is a global war. That war is the war on talent. And the businesses need the employees to make their operations successful. The president simply doesn't have the people in the U.S. to accomplish that goal.
On another sort of subject here, somewhat related, you had a big announcement today specifically for Windsor about Ontario's Building Faster Fund. Tell me a little bit about what the announcement today means for your community.
Well, it's great. I mean, we have pressed on all fronts to play our part to see more housing built in the city of Windsor. We recognize we're one city of many, but no matter where you live in our country, we know that there is an affordability crisis. We know that there is a housing crunch in front of us. We're no different here down in Windsor. And so we've applied a lot of resources to get applications and permitting through the process much faster. And what you saw today was the city of Windsor being awarded $5.2 million under the Building Faster Fund, which was recognition that we exceeded the target set for us by the province by 213%. And so we built a lot of new units last year. We saw that being built, and we played our part, which is moving applications through the process. And so we're delighted to receive, anytime the Premier wants to come down and give us a $5.2 million check, we are delighted to receive that.
Last question to you really quickly. There has been some criticism that perhaps that the Liberal government hasn't, it's only been just over 100 days, but perhaps the Liberal government the new Liberal government could be taking more initiatives when it comes to housing development and the housing file. Do you have any concerns from your position as a mayor?
Well, I can tell you that the Prime Minister made a couple of comments in the election period. One was that he was going to cut development charges in half and make cities whole. The other was that he was going to provide low interest loans for multi-res development. And you have a lot of folks in the development community who are sitting on the sidelines waiting for answers on how that's going to happen, because the implementation of those two things is material for their bottom line. And they're waiting for the pro formas to make sense to take them to a bank. And so we need some answers on that sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we're going to miss a significant part of the construction season this year.
How quickly would you like to see that happen?
Yesterday.
Fair enough.
Yesterday.
Fair enough.
We need those answers soon. And I know Minister Robertson sat on the Big City Mayor's Caucus with him. He's a great individual, and I'm sure he's working very hard to get there. But sooner rather than later, we need to see some response here to get the developers off the sideline and the shovels in the ground. All
right, Mayor Drew Dilkens, thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford has yet again expressed his frustration with U.S. President Donald Trump and the tariffs he continues to levy against Canada.
My message to the Americans, this does not work. Tariffs do not work. I've been pounding the president and Howard Lutnick, Secretary Lutnick. You're doing nothing but hurting the American people. When you tariff Canadians, you're hurting Americans, and proof is in the pudding now. The auto sector, you heard, is $6.5 billion they've lost. And that's just the beginning. Sorry, I'm getting a little passionate today about this, because that guy drives me crazy down south, I'll tell you, and 41 million other Canadians.
This comes as Canada and the U.S. have blown past several trade deadlines. Ford plans to sit down with Prime Minister Mark Carney for a one-on-one meeting next Monday. Could this have any sort of impact on the direction Canada takes in the trade talks? Let's ask the power panel. Emily Nicolas is a columnist for Le Devoir. Michelle Cadario was the Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Paul Martin. And here with me in the studio is Kate Harrison, a Conservative political analyst. Michelle, I'm going to start with you. Doug Ford is headed to Ottawa. He's going to be meeting with Mark Carney. We know that they have a difference of opinion in terms of what they think the next best step is. What are you sort of expecting to come out of this meeting?
Well, I expect that the working relationship that the Premier and the Prime Minister have built over the last number of months will continue on. I think that the Premier is vocalizing some of that frustration that Canadians feel, that quite frankly, undoubtedly, Mark Carney feels as well. I don't think anybody's happy, certainly with this situation. But I also think that the Premier realizes that no one wants to come to a solution more than the Prime Minister, and that it's just not within our control about the timing. It is not a normal negotiation. It's not a normal kind of, administration officials to our officials. This is very much in the hands of one person. And I think that they're going to undoubtedly be constructive about not just kind of focusing completely on Trump, but focusing on what they need to do together, and what each government needs to do to help the families and the businesses that are really struggling right now and so deeply impacted by these tariffs.
Now, Kate, Doug Ford is a progressive conservative from Ontario. Mark Carney, obviously a Liberal. Even though that they are from different branches of the political spectrum, that they have worked they've worked together on this issue. We haven't seen necessarily Doug Ford sort of working closely with Pierre Poilievre necessarily on this issue. At least we saw that during the election campaign back in the day. I'm just wondering what you think about Prime Minister Mark Carney. Does he need to do more reaching across the aisle, perhaps, to Pierre Poilievre, especially with the by-election, really close ahead?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that there are some things that the federal Conservatives have proposed in the Canada Sovereignty Act that they're looking at tabling this fall that the Liberal government may notionally agree with. And I would hope in the same way that the federal Conservatives approached some of the conversations around nation-building infrastructure and support for C5, that the federal Liberals would look to some of the ideas that are coming forward from the federal Conservatives for implementation, because that seems to be in the spirit of collaboration right now. I do wonder if some assessment is needed on the part of the good cop, bad cop routine that I think is in place right now between the Prime Minister and the Ontario Premier. We don't appear to be further along, despite Premier Ford's interjections and interventions and frustrations and his vocalization of those with the U.S. administration. And so as we see more and more countries establish agreements, admittedly not ones that would be beneficial for Canada if they were to be carbon copied, but as we see that happen, as we see Mexico and China negotiate a stay in tariff applications or a pause as negotiations continue, and Canada not getting that, I think that it's a time for the premiers and for the Prime Minister to take stock of whether or not the current approach is actually working.
Yeah, on that point, Emily, I want to ask you, things do seem to be at least publicly facing sort of in this sort of stuck, at least at this point. I'm curious, do you think that there needs to be reconsideration of the Canadian approach, given that we haven't seen the kind of progress that many Canadians had maybe hoped for?
It depends on the Canadian approach on what. There is two fronts, basically. There is the front of the negotiation with the U.S., and this is what we've been discussing so far. But there's also the front of what do we do domestically in Canada to reinforce our own economy and our own resilience to Trump's attack, and that might actually change the footing on which we stand to be having those negotiations on the future. And it's important to note that Doug Ford also insisted on that other part of the conversation and what he said publicly and what he wants to be speaking to Mark Carney about, that for him, it is about essentially cutting more taxes for individuals and businesses. And I think that's really something to stress, is that in this big crisis that Canada is going through, everybody's going to be pushing for policy solutions that happen to align with ideological belief that they had prior to this crisis. And so this is something that will be done by Conservatives and by Neo-Democrats and by Liberals alike. And there is a great debate to be had in terms of what do we do domestically as well as internationally. But to me, this is what I take from what's been happening in terms of the exchanges between Doug Ford and Mark Carney. It's a backup good cut strategy in terms of speaking to Donald Trump, but it's also saying, hey, if you want to make Canada stronger, you should be doing what I believe you should be doing, while at the same time there's very progressive Canadians who voted for Mark Carney because they wanted to avoid a Conservative government. And so this coalition that Mark Carney is standing on is on really thin ice in many ways. And that's going to be something that I think when Parliament is back in session, we're going to be seeing Trump wear a circle that's going to be harder and harder to do with the months passing.
Michelle, what do you make of that point that Emily just made there? Do you think that this coalition is on thinner ice now and there will be more pressure on Mark Carney as we head into the fall session?
Well, without question, as the economy continues on, as these tariffs continue on, of course there's more pressure on Mr. Carney. It will be vocalized in the House of Commons every day, and that he'll have to be answering to in there. But I got to say, I don't think anybody bears the weight or the responsibility more than Mark Carney does. He understands what's at stake. He understands what expectations are out there of him. I think he probably puts more pressure on himself than anybody else could. At the same time, I also think that he's very open to ideas about what might help the economy, what might help us save jobs, and what might help us to kind of have as soft of a slowdown as it appears that we might be leading to. And so I think that collaboration is going to continue amongst the provinces and the federal government right across the country. I don't know that Mark Carney is so tied to ideological rigidity that he wouldn't be open to a good idea. He knows the economy and he knows how the global economy works. And so I think that he would never reject something if it was just because it came from a Conservative or an NDP person. I think that is going to kind of help us as we move forward and they put their budget together.
Kate, assuming that Pierre Poilievre wins the by-election, are you anticipating a different tone that Pierre Poilievre took with Justin Trudeau versus Mark Carney when it comes to the Canada-U.S. relations, when it comes to trying to reach a trade deal? Are you expecting there to be perhaps a different tone there because these are two very different relationships?
Yeah, I think that's already been signaled in some ways. You saw the federal Conservatives back some of the proposals that the Liberals put forward in the brief time that we were in the House. But I don't expect the role of the official opposition to change fundamentally. Mm-hmm. They are there to hold the government to account. They are there to point out some of the realities that we face on tariffs and trade. I also think that they're doing a good and important job of reminding Canadians of the many other issues that are on the table. And, I would expect that the Premier, when he sits down with the Prime Minister next week, is not hopefully talking just about trade and tariffs. Hopefully he's talking about housing starts being abysmal per the reporting that just happened before. Hopefully he's talking about youth unemployment being at a 25-year high. Hopefully he's talking about the lines at food banks being increasingly long. Like, there are many other systemic issues in this country that Canadians are grappling with, that they were grappling with before the tariff trade dispute, that they're continuing to grapple with now. And so I would expect that the Premier of Ontario is bringing that forward to the Prime Minister, and the official opposition certainly will come the fall session.
Emily, I want to ask you sort of on that point, as well as something that Michelle had said. This idea that perhaps the Prime Minister would be open to considering ideas from perhaps the Conservatives, the NDP. There was cooperation between the NDP and the Liberals during the last government. But do you think that because this is such an issue that, so much is at stake and Canadians have sort of united behind, do you anticipate this is something where there could be space for cooperation between parties, at least in trying to get to the goal of a trade deal?
I think it's between parties, but I think it's also between elements of, Canadian society more generally. And it says that when you're going to look at the House of Commons when it starts again in September, the reality is that a good chunk of the NDP has been swallowed by the Liberals, and that there's few MPs left, and that those who are left are without leaders. That doesn't mean that what the NDP stands for in terms of ideas is something that's gone within this country. It just means that the people who stood for those ideas really did not want Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister. That's what it. And so you're not going to find that voice really strong in Parliament. So it depends as well. So there's the House of Commons and whatever it means in terms of our very imperfect democratic electoral system. But there's also how the Prime Minister listens to Canadians in general, what relationship he develops, for example, with unions. I think in terms of Canadian left, that's more where the strong voice will likely be heard in the next couple of months, given the economic negotiations. and other elements of other economic actors. But if we only focus on the House of Commons, then the Conservative movement and the Bloc Québécois will look perhaps loom larger than they do in actual Canadian population. So there might be a discrepancy between the polls and what you see in terms of the House of Commons, which is what we have in the first past the poll system always, but we need to be perhaps maybe a little bit extra careful with this one.
Michelle, we have less than a minute left. I want to get to you to react to a point that Kate had made about how much patience Canadians might continue to have. Trade and dealing with Donald Trump is the key issue that everyone is talking about right now. Most of the government is focused on in this moment. But what is the risk here? What is the danger of some of those other key issues that Mark Carney campaigned on if we don't start to see some change or progress there?
Well, I think first and foremost, Canadians are concerned with the economy because they're concerned with jobs. And that kind of leads to the affordability issue that Kate referenced as well. She also said, as I agree with, it's not like any country is running away with a whopping great deal that we would want to replicate in any way. In fact, every deal that has been kind of signed would be worse off than we are today with a certain level of tariffs that we have right now on the non-CUSMA goods. So, I think that we have to put everything into context. And I go back to Mark Carney said, no deal is better than a bad deal for Canada.
All right. Michelle, I hate to jump in. We are out of time, taking it right to the buzzer. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.